All right, so second video here, we're going to be looking at a different type of text. Last video, we looked at Bartholomew de las Casas in Defense of the Indians, which was a primary source written in the time period, about the time period. Today, we're going to be looking at a secondary source, which is written after the time period, about the time period, okay? So the first thing we do when we look at a text is we look at the source. The source is Howard Zinn. The article this was, or from the book, A People's History of the United States. So it is a book that he wrote in 1980, and this chapter or this section was called Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. So we know already that this passage is going to mention, maybe not directly, Christopher Columbus and Native Americans, okay? So let's go ahead and dive in and read it. And as we read with a document, we always quickly annotate, and all those annotations are going to help us fill out the HIPPY and historically analyze this document, okay? I'm sorry about my camera. It's just decided to be real funky, okay? So let's dive in. When it became clear that there was no gold left, the Indians were taken as slave labor on huge estates known as encomiendas. So we know that already. They were worked at a ferocious pace and died by the thousands. By the year 1511, there were perhaps 50,000 Indians left. By 1550, there were 500. A report of the year 1650 shows none of the original Arawaks or their descendants left on the island. So I'm going to annotate a little bit. When it became clear that there was no gold left, so they wanted gold first and foremost. That was number one in their head when they showed up. Okay? Then they enslaved them. So working on farms was number two in their head. That's what those Spanish conquistadors wanted. They were worked at a ferocious pace and died by the thousands. We know that they died because of what? Violence and disease is what killed a bunch of Native Americans, okay? By the year 1511, there were perhaps 50,000 Indians left. Now, he's being very specific. Not 50,000 Indians left in the whole North and South America. He's talking about where Columbus landed. Where did Columbus land? If you read your textbook, you would know the island of Hispaniola. I spelled that wrong. I know I did. The island of Hispaniola, okay? So on this island, he says perhaps 50,000 Indians were left in 1511. By 1550, 500. So within this 40-year period, they're getting wiped out in the thousands. And then he's saying by 1650, there were no original Arawaks or their descendants left on the island. And again, that island is the island of Hispaniola, where Columbus landed originally. Okay? And we know that the people that he encountered were the Arawaks. Okay? So let's talk about historical context. Well, what's he even freaking talking about? Okay? In 1492 is where we begin. In 1492, Christopher Columbus did what? Christopher Columbus sailed to the New World, but when he got there, did he think he was in the New World? Y'all, he thought he was in India. Sailed to the New World, claiming to have found India. Okay, so far we've just given kind of a context. Okay, so what's been happening? Why did he sail to the New World? Why did this even end up happening? That's our historical context. The Spanish crown paid this Italian man, paid him to find and claim land for Spain and trade for Spain. So our context is, in this world of colonization, Spain is trying to get ahead. They pay someone to go sail to the New World, and it's India. Well, he thinks it's India. It's now called the West Indies. He thinks he's landed in India. He thinks he's going to claim this land and get all this trade for Spain. Who does he encounter? He encounters natives. There, he encounters the Arawak natives. Okay? And that brings us up to speed to what happened here. So we know why he's coming. We know who paid him. He meets the natives. Boom. What happens? he starts exploiting them. So it's kind of like the highlight reel. Historical context is kind of like the highlight reel of what happens before the document actually begins. I definitely did not leave myself enough room, and I'm so sorry about my handwriting. Just get used to it. All right, intended audience. Who does Howard Zinn want to read this book? This is where it gets tricky. You don't know Howard Zinn. You just know he's giving y'all the real story of Christopher Columbus, not 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, let's have a holiday and get off school because of him, okay? He wants you to know the real story. So who is his intended audience? Obviously, his IA, and I'm going to abbreviate for shortness purposes, his IA are his history readers, right? Because you'd be reading this book, A People's History of the United States, but more specifically, those interested in what? He's showing another side, those interested in reading a different perspective. He wants people to see the other side. And this kind of even bleeds into our purpose. What is his purpose in writing them? He wants to reframe, and I should have put Zinn. Zinn wants to. He wants to reframe how history is viewed. He wants to reframe how history is viewed and call into question, I would say, quote, heroes like Columbus, right? He is looking at Columbus from the perspective of a Native American. From the perspective of a Native American, dude ain't no hero, okay? He's a killer. He's a murderer. He's a slave master, okay? He's an exploiter of Native American populations. And Zinn wants you to see that. That's his purpose. So what is Zinn's point of view? Obviously, Zinn is writing a secondary source, right? We don't know very much about him. And this isn't enough. This doesn't answer our point of view. We don't know very much about him besides that he wants people to see another side. That's his purpose. And he wants an audience that is interested in reading a different perspective. So what is his point of view? We would say that he's writing a secondary source, and his point of view is like a revisionist, looking back at history. He's writing a secondary source as a historian who wants to revise the narrative. He wants to give a voice to the Native American populations instead of just this hero Columbus that we learn about. That's the point of his text here. That's the point of this chapter of his book, okay? So he's writing a secondary source as a historian who wants to revise the narrative. Sometimes people call this revisionist history. Revisionist history. And revisionist history gets like a bad reputation. Like some people are like, why would you revise history? History doesn't change. History does change because before the civil rights movement, before our modern day civil rights movement, people looked at history in terms of what white people did and what European people did. Nowadays, we need things like people revising the narrative of history to take a look back and be like, oh, wait, there were people of color and there were women and there were subjugated populations that lived during that time period too. Where's their voice? Where's their history? So don't think that this is a bad word. Sometimes in the news you hear revisionist history as if it's naughty. It's not. It's looking back and revising what we know about history based on what we know now. That people were important even if they couldn't read or write or if their skin was a different color, okay? And Howard Zinn is really good about presenting people were important. It's not just the heroes who were important. Okay. Oh my gosh, I've just like gone on a little rant here. So why is it important? I literally just told you. So this perspective perspective long term. Thinking about long term, why is it important that we know the perspective of the Arawaks and what happened to the Arawaks and not just Columbus? I know you learned about Columbus when you were little in grade school. Why didn't you learn about the Arawaks when you were little in grade school? This perspective sheds light on natives and other subjugated peoples who usually aren't mentioned in history, right? We have to think critically about history, and that's what Howard Zinn is really good about doing in this passage. That's what De las Casas was really good at doing. Nope, that's still Howard Zinn. That's what De las Casas was really good about doing in the time period. He was a revisionist historian before it's cool. Looking at a different perspective. And that's kind of what historical document analysis is about. So this perspective sheds light on Native and other subjugated people who usually aren't mentioned in history. It also calls into question who? Calls into question historical heroes like Columbus. And it's fair to say that all of our historical heroes need to be called into question because they were all human and they're not all perfect. So always think about that when you're reading a secondary source. The person that is writing this was not perfect. So what is their point of view? Why is that important that we know it in history? Like that sort of thing. Okay? The people that we're learning about weren't perfect people. Some of them were downright awful, nasty people like Columbus. Another thing we could talk about why this document is important, think about it another way. What if Columbus had treated the Arawaks kindly and had traded with them equally? That would have set the tone that all Spaniards should treat natives kindly and trade with them equally. So another why is it important? Columbus set the tone. And by that I mean he made it so that automatically Spaniards just treated Native Americans horribly and as less than and as inferior. He started that trend. And that trend continued. And when I say trend, I mean I would have you write it out. That trend of treating Native Americans horribly continued. By the Spanish, by the English, some by the Dutch and French, but mostly the Spanish and English. Okay, that's all for this video. Woohoo!